All right. Good evening and welcome to the City of Topeka Planning Commission meeting. We are a commission appointed by the mayor and city council to plan for the orderly growth and development of the community, to hold public meetings, and to make recommendations to the city council on planning items. Please note that the city council rules state that the public hearings for planning cases shall be conducted solely by the planning commission. No additional public hearings will be conducted by the city council. Tonight's cases are tentatively scheduled to be heard by the city council next month. Agendas can be found at topeka.org. For cases that require public hearings, the procedure will be as follows. First, the planning department staff will summarize the case. Next, we will hear from the applicant or their representative. Then we will receive public testimony. Public comments should be addressed solely to the chair and are limited to 4 minutes. Chris, please take the roll, and I believe we have the rest of our group joining us. Yeah, thanks.
Apologies. Weather. As Brian was saying, we're ready for the roll.
Mr. Armstrong.
Here.
Mr. Freed.
Here.
Mr. Dean.
Here.
Ms. Jordan.
Here.
Mr. Canara.
Here.
Ms. Lawson.
Here.
Ms. Messina.
Here.
Ms. Ringler.
Here.
Mr. Warner is not here, but he said he was going to be, but we have 8 and a quorum.
Perfect. All right. Apologies. So we have done the roll call. We are ready to move on to approval of the minutes. We have minutes from both March 18th and also April 22nd, our work session. Is there any comments, corrections?
There is, well, I just want to confirm that as listed within the discussion item of the visual code update, the last paragraph is, it does not specify commissioners in there. Is that meant to include the request for a sunset provision on all the old, so that the new code would come into effect for all signs at a date? Given I don't read that it indicates that, but it was requested.
Are you referring to the minutes?
In the minutes, yes. The last paragraph in it, it states it was ultimately agreed the visual code update will come back to the commission on May 20th. I had requested during our discussion that we have some discussion item or ability or ideas put forward as to a date certain when codes would have to come in, or signs would have to come in compliance with the new code. And perhaps that explains why it's not.
Yeah, in terms of, if you want that added to the minutes, in terms of a question, we certainly can look at that. If you would like an answer, I think that's going to be covered tonight in our...
Right, I was just meaning to get to it, that it was in the minutes, because I didn't see it necessarily addressed in detail in our notes. That's the only comment I have.
Are there any other comments, corrections, notes for either March or April? Okay. With that note, is there a motion?
Would move to amend, or to adopt, to approve the minutes as amended.
Second.
Chris?
Is this for just March, or is it for March and April?
Just for March, I think we
Just for
should do
March,
them one at a
and
time.
second for March as well, so just for March.
Okay. Mr. Armstrong.
Aye.
Mr. Freed.
Aye.
Mr. Dean.
Aye.
Ms. Jordan.
Abstain.
Mr. Canard.
Aye.
Ms. Lawson.
Abstain.
Ms. Messina.
Aye.
Ms. Ringler,
Aye.
Mr. Warner.
Abstain.
All right, motion passes 6-0 with 3 abstaining.
Okay. So the April 22nd minutes address our work session that had to do with the staff reports. Dr. Johnson from KU led us in a study session. Are there any corrections, edits, notes on those minutes?
Motion to approve the April 22nd minutes.
I second.
Okay, those have been motion and seconded to approve.
Mr. Warner,
Aye.
Ms. Ringler,
Aye.
Ms. Messina,
Abstain.
Ms. Lawson,
Aye.
Mr. Kennard,
Aye.
Ms. Jordan,
Abstain.
Mr. Dean,
Aye.
Mr. Freed,
Abstain?
and Mr. Armstrong.
Aye.
Motion passes 6-0 with 3 abstaining.
Next on our agenda is any declarations of conflict of interest or ex parte communications by members of the commission or staff. Are there any declarations? Hearing none, we will move on to our public hearings portion of the agenda. First on the agenda is Z1903 by Charles T. and Margarita Lopez, requesting to amend the district zoning classification from OI1 Office and Institutional District to M1 Two-Family Dwelling, 2715 Southeast Indiana Avenue. Mr. Hall?
Madam Chair, I'll be covering this item in Annie's stead. So this is an application to change the zoning from ONI 1 Office and Institutional District to M1 Two-Family District. This is changing it from, the zoning change would result in a less restrictive, or excuse me, a more restrictive district. It's commonly known as a down zone. Staff is recommending approval. And we have a recommendation on page 2 of the staff report along with the recommended motion. Just a little bit of background. This property contains an existing single-family residence with an accessory dwelling unit. The residence has been on the property since 1926. The M1 district is a two-family and single-family dwelling district. It allows for those uses. The O&I district allows for a limited range of non-residential and non-commercial uses such as office, professional, and administrative operations. Character of the neighborhoods, predominant character of the neighborhood in both land use and form is single-family residential and neighborhood-scaled commercial land uses. The neighborhood also contains a variety of institutional land uses and buildings of various sizes. So there are a variety of uses in the neighborhood. The commercial district immediately to the north is rather kind of small in scale, buildings close to the street. Many of these buildings are vacant. There's the zoning map, shows you the subject property. Property on the south is zone ONI 1, and it's the genealogical library, so it's an institutional use. The property has been in this use, as I mentioned before, for a very long time. The zoning change occurred in 1957 to allow a commercial use. Apparently that didn't happen. The accessory building was constructed sometime near 1959 and is considered a legal non-conforming use. The change in the zoning is consistent with the comprehensive plan, specifically the Central Highland Park Neighborhood Plan, primarily because the proposed rezoning from ONI 1 to M1 allows for an appropriate transition from commercial at the intersection into the residential neighborhood and accommodates the existing single-family residence and the accessory dwelling unit. The neighborhood plan supports rezoning requests to a less intensive district to reflect the current use of the property, such as is the case. This being just a conventional straight change in zoning, there are no conditions attached to it. And with that, I will take any questions you might have.
Are there any questions for staff? Hearing none, I'll open this case up for public hearing. Is there anyone who would like to come and speak to this agenda item? please approach the podium if you'd like to speak. Be sure to state your name.
My name is Marty Flanagan, and I'm president of the Topeka Genealogical Society. We've been at that present location for somewhere around 30 years. The property was given to us by a member, and it is my understanding that the property to the north of ours, which is the property in question here for the zoning, was also part of the member who gave us the property, part of their land as well. And of course, they have moved and no longer own that property, obviously, for a number of years. Our major concern is what the zoning might do to us in the future, whether if we decide we need to sell for whatever reason. At the present time, the property has no kitchen, does not have any full bathrooms. We have two sinks and two stools, that's it. And so our concern is that that is somehow we might be forced out of our investment in the property in the future, because on the south side, I believe, is a residence, and if the zoning passed, then the residence to the north of us would also be a residence. Of course, we have a school across from us, and I know that we're zoned institutional at the present time, which is probably the correct designation for us. But the problem is future, and that's our major concern. So I hope you take that in consideration when you decide to look at it. And another thing that might be of concern, and I think it certainly needs to be addressed, is that we do share a driveway. Frankly, that's going to have to be researched to see exactly which property owner owns that, and where the property line actually is, simply because that property was at one time owned by one owner. And I'm open to any questions you may have of me.
Are there any questions for this speaker?
Thank you for listening.
Is there anyone else who'd like to speak to this agenda item? Seeing none, I'll close the public hearing. Any questions, discussion by commissioners? Mr. Armstrong?
I guess this zoning change doesn't affect the property adjacent, correct?
That's correct. It has no direct effect on this property. There would be no anticipated zoning change to the genealogical library property as a result of this zoning change. The only way it might affect them is if they redevelop their property. I suppose it could affect the standards for landscaping and screening along the edges, but that's not going to affect their current use of the property. What's that? Oh.
To take it one step further, the neighborhood plan for Central Highland Park does propose a mixed-use land use, which for that north half of the block, which includes the genealogical property. So it's in essence protected. You have zoning that protects that. The only way that you would lose that zoning from the property is if you were to come in and do that on your own. There is no intent here to rezone your property as a result of this rezoning, I can assure you. So hopefully that helps you feel a little better about whatever direction this goes.
And just to clarify, if someone in the future, they wanted to sell their property and someone else wanted to use that property for a different use, then they could approach the city to see about rezoning, correct?
Correct, yes. Much like what happened here with this property where it had been a residence for so many years, and our zoning code had permitted that way back when, so it's just a vestige of an old code, really, when we're cleaning it up here tonight.
And I'm guessing, did I read the reason for this is the current resident wants to sell the property and that this was suggested? I'm guessing they're gonna run into having to define that shared use drive as a part of selling it?
Yes, that would be a civil matter between the two property owners, and that I suppose that's something they would have to resolve.
Would that occur no matter if it was changed or not?
Yeah, it still remains a matter at issue, I
The zoning
suppose.
doesn't change that.
The zoning does not affect that, correct?
Any other questions? Discussion? Is there a motion?
Madam Chair, based on the findings and analysis of the staff report, I move to recommend to the governing body approval of the reclassification of property from O and I-1 Office and Institutional District to M1 Two-Family Dwelling District.
Second.
Been a motion to approve and a second. Chris, will you call the roll?
Mr. Armstrong,
Aye.
Mr. Freed,
Aye.
Mr. Dean,
Aye.
Ms. Jordan,
Aye.
Mr. Kennard,
Aye.
Ms. Lawson,
Aye.
Ms. Messina,
Aye.
Ms. Ringler,
Aye.
Mr. Warner.
Aye.
Motion passes 9-0.
Next on our agenda is our much-anticipated visual code update, our sign code update. Let's see, Mr. Feilander.
I will take that as a very sincere
I am.
anticipation. Yes, you're right. Hey, we made it. 19 months after kicking this project off in November of 2017, we are here. So, yeah, tonight we want to present a overview and some of the changes that you haven't seen since March work session, so you can potentially recommend this forward to the governing body in your deliberations tonight. Before I get, so I'm going to do a little bit of overview. We're not going to go through the same presentation that you've seen over and over, but we are going to hit some highlights and then cover some changes that we wanted to bring to your attention since we last met. First, I wanted to just a couple thanks to get here. The two people on either side of me, Chris Wagers, Mike Hall, could not obviously have been here without them. Mike Hall, yeoman's work to get this here. Mike's going to need a vacation soon, one way or the other. So thank them, thank our committee, our sign committee, Chairman Ringler, Virginia Baumgartner, Cindy Pruitt, and from Luminous, Rod Hart, Custom Neon, Steve G. from Fast Signs, Johnny Ray Huffman from Guard Sales, and Becky Sopi, our zoning inspector. We also had some legal help, our very own Mary Feeney, Deputy City Attorney. We also had Mark White from White and Smith, who has been with us from the beginning, advising us on best practices. We also had a lot of public input on this. We had 960-some responses to our visual appeal survey. We had 380-plus comments. We had 2 public meetings. We've heard from a lot, and there's no way we could be here tonight without that public input. So, and then thank you to you. You've given us a lot of direction, and you've been extremely patient. So hopefully that'll pay off here soon. All right, as I said tonight, we want to hold a public hearing. We really want to do three things. One is present to you those changes that are in the code, and Mr. Hall will do that. We want to hear from any of the public tonight. We want and consider their testimony, and then allow you to deliberate and consider any changes, amendments, or recommendations for moving this forward one way or the other. We passed out, you should have 4 things. You were already given your 3-ring binder. You've also, which has 3 things in it. One was our cover memo at the beginning, but more importantly than the cover memo is After the cover memo, there's an attachment. It says sign code options. There's 4 pages. We're going to go over that. I'm not. Mr. Hall will. So be ready for that. And then after that, in the book, you have 2 tabs. You have one tab. The first tab is what we call the handbook, which is, again, you've seen that. That's our presentation. That's kind of our summary. We're not going to go over that in depth tonight or in its entirety. We will use that as a resource to go to and show you and show the public those examples that we have in there. And then the second tab is the actual sign code. So that is that's the 35 pages of written narrative and text and tables and pictures that you would act on, amending or making motions on. So that second tab is the one you would be taking action on. Okay, that said, we are totally prepared to get into any of that information in more detail or depth at your pleasure. But for sake of your time and to really hit on some of the key highlights, I think we wanted to prioritize some things here. So I'll do a quick overview of the themes and the points of emphasis of the code, and then Mr. Hall will get into the more detailed changes that he wants to go over. And I forgot, you also have a 4th item tonight that was handed out, that was walked up tonight. Mr. Hall will go over that. These are some more mundane changes. I don't know, is that fair?
Some more mundane than others,
But they're,
some not so mundane.
but they weren't in the draft that you received, so these are things we caught as we were looking at it last week. Okay, so as many of you know, this is really the first update of its kind for our sign code in 50-plus years for the city. And so this is a huge milestone, however this goes. The major intent and impetus of this has been about improving the city's visual appeal, aesthetic appeal. And that has been well documented in the Greater Topeka Partnerships Momentum 2022. We also have to respond to some court decisions that were made. U.S. Supreme Court, Reed versus Gilbert, how many times have you heard that? So that we can regulate by time, place, and manner, not content. And then lastly, the downtown standards. Many of you, I think, adopted new downtown sign standards, which ultimately was adopted by the governing body. So we want to basically expand that and continue that citywide. So some of the points of emphasis in the themes in the draft sign code before you is, number 1, you will find, and this is for the public's help as well, maximum sign size would generally be proportionate to property and building size instead of the one size fits all, which is what we have now in our code. Secondly, we have a lot of discrepancy between some of our zoning districts in size and height and things like that. So we want to basically soften that discrepancy and have our zoning districts be a little more uniform and not so drastic changes between, say, office and commercial. The commercial zoning districts, you would see reduced sign size and height, except we have made some exceptions along highway intersections and for shopping centers and commerce parks. Mr. Hall, we did bring you some options to look at that. Mr. Hall will go over one of those tonight. On the other hand, non-commercial uses and areas would see more relaxed standards. As I said, we're trying to make it a little more uniform throughout the community not so despairing. Not despairing. All new freestanding signs would be of a monument style. No new pole signs would not be permitted for the most part. Some exceptions there. All temporary signs, this also covers temporary signs, those will all be accommodated in some manner, with the exception that we're proposing for portable message center signs, although we did bring you options back on that tonight as well. So that's another thing Mr. Hall will touch on. Something the current code doesn't cover is abandoned signs. We do not address that. And so through the input we receive from you and public, we are addressing that. Some abandoned signs will be subject to removal. We have options on that Mr. Hall will go over. And then last, non-conforming signs, whatever signs that are made non-conforming by adoption of this code can continue. They would be able to continue. There's no sunset proposed, although I think that's an option that Mr. Hall will go over. However, any changes to sizes would trigger some partial or full compliance. So that's, again, covered under our options section. So those were the things I talked, that you heard me say there's options on. Those are sort of, that's kind of what is the focus of our talk tonight. And hopefully that'll be more constructive. So before I hand it over to Mr. Hall, does anybody have any questions before we start those options and changes? Is that, do you want to do the options first, Mike?
Yeah.
Is that, because those are the kind of the.
That's what was important to the commission when we met before, so.
So we'll do that.
Do that first.
If that's okay?
Any
Right,
questions or preferences on that?
Okay.
Okay, thank you. Just want to bring to your attention for the record, something that was in previous packets. This? Oh, thank you. Something that was in previous packets, but wanted to make sure it was included in this one. This is the correspondence and email from Sean Holthouse. He owns probably most of the portable message center signs, and he leases them out. This is an email from February 1st, and he's expressed in this email and in other forums his concerns about restrictions on portable message centers for obvious reasons. So in your packet, we talked about the options. So if you turn to the first one, the highway sign option, highway sign exception, and wait till we get to the slide.
There you go.
Okay. All right, so the way this would work, what we had proposed earlier was that if you consider what's allowed in a C4 district, C4 is probably the most common commercial district in the city, probably the least restrictive of the C districts. I-1 and I-2 districts are similar in the type of signage that's allowed, or they're the same actually. Industrial districts. As proposed, the baseline standard would be 25 feet high, monument-style sign, half a square foot per linear foot, not to exceed 120 square feet in size. So what we had talked about at the last meeting was allowing an exception at highway interchanges. The rationale for doing that is that signs are really, according to the purpose statement that we're proposing, primarily for wayfinding and not so much for advertising like a billboard. And so there's some nexus to allow some exception for these signs in their height and size near interchanges, for safety reasons, for convenience, and for commerce. So what we proposed before is an exception be granted measuring from the center line, where the center line of the interstate meets the center line of the arterial or collector street that crosses the interstate, measuring a radius of 700 feet, and also within a certain distance of where the ramp, the on-ramp, connects with the arterial or collector that's crossing that. We got some feedback on that, some concern about that. We took a closer look at that, and we are recommending, the height that would be allowed, in the C4 district, the height that would be allowed as an exception would be to up to 55 feet, which is the current standard that applies, and to a size of 250 square feet. So what we came back with, and I did meet with the committee on this, is increasing the radius to 800 feet and replacing the 120 feet, or replacing the language that allowed for an exception where there's a radius around a ramp in a cross street to being anything within 120 feet of the right-of-way for a ramp. So it's a little more, it's a little less onerous, it's a little more generous, if you will. But we're still recommending that it be a radius around an interchange. If you have questions about how that looks on a map, we can pull that up and look at it. Any questions about that?
It would be helpful if you could show that on a map, so
Okay.
particularly with the on-ramp part of it.
Option A does start at center lines of highways. I'm trying to figure out if that is the same restriction to I-70, US 75, I-470, or am I not reading that right?
So it would apply to I-470, I-70, US 75, and US 24. So I'll be able to show, I think, on here.
You want this one or another one?
That's a good one. Yeah, that's probably a good one. Or the one at Fairlawn's probably a good one, too. That is Fairlawn. Okay. So I wonder if I can't do this, can I? I can't do that. Okay. So if you can try to visualize where Fairlawn is an arterial, where it crosses the interstate, and where there's direct access from a ramp. So where that crosses the interstate, the center line of the arterial and the center line of the interstate, that's a point. I don't think we have it marked very well, but does everybody understand sort of where that is? So then you take that circle that's superimposed on there is a 700-foot radius. So if you look at that, increase that by 100 feet, that's what we're recommending. Now the ramp, this one will have, the recommended change will not have a lot of impact on this particular interchange because the ramps almost are entirely within that radius. But if you look at where if you can see the ramps, yeah, right there, and the ramp is right-of-way, it's KDOT right-of-way. If you measure 120 feet from that ramp in toward the property, signs located within that 120 feet would qualify for that exception.
Just to clarify, you're talking about the placement of the sign within that buffer area, not necessarily just the placement of the property. So if they wanted to put a sign on the opposite side of their property, that would be outside of that buffer area, but the buffer area clips the corner of their property, how would that be treated?
The sign's located within that area, so it's not the parcel. And the reason for that is some parcels can be really large. So you could be really a long distance from the interchange, and that's not the intent of this exception. And that is that 21st?
That's on tune.
Oh, that's Huntoon, okay. So again, you can see the radius at 700 feet. That one you can really see the center point, I think, pretty well. And you extend that by 100 feet. What you can see there is you pick up properties on the other side of Wanamaker. So
So I have a question, if you could go back to that for a second. So the ramps on the southeast side of that are outside the radius, right? But those would now be within the exception.
This is split. It's gonna have its own 2 circles, I bet.
Yeah, it is.
Okay.
Yep, it is. So there's gonna be a circle
split.
that's Wanamaker. So there's gonna be a center point with Wanamaker and,
Gotcha.
and I-470. There are some ramps, it's hard for me to even see it. So these examples we're looking at, it doesn't do that much to include that ramp radius in there. There are a few interchanges around the city where it does make a difference. I don't know if I have any in this file. That's 21st. So that could have some kind of effect. You can kind of see the ramp right away on the north side. On the west side of, this is at 21st and I-470. So you can see the ramp right away there.
So that's where you can put a sign, but who can put a sign in the circle?
Only-
Anyone that's within the circle?
Only, it can only be an on-premise sign. So the owner of the property or the use on that property can have a sign that identifies that use, but it can only be allowed in that area, in that exception area.
Okay, so for that one specifically, the McDonald's sign that's there, or the McDonald's down the block, is no longer positioned correctly.
Currently, that does not conform to our code because it's an off-premise sign. And this would not affect that at all. It's just an off-premise sign, it's not permitted.
Yeah, so McDonald's couldn't come and ask property owner X right here, hey, can I put up a McDonald's, a
Right.
new McDonald's sign here?
Right.
That would be an off-premise sign, would not be allowed, so it's only the property owner that's within the radius.
Correct.
And then the 700 to 800 feet, we're just trying to capture more properties, or?
It picks up a few more. Is that 800 feet? I'm not going to say it's scientifically derived, but it does pick up a few more properties. If you want to relate it to anything, a quarter mile is 1,320 feet. Half of that, an eighth of a mile, is a little less than 700 feet. So this isn't a quarter mile. It's a little more than an eighth of a mile.
And I don't recall if we discussed this in March. Was there a reason as to why we wanted to expand that area?
I think it was just discussion with the committee. So I'm not sure I have a great reason. Maybe other folks can speak to that.
My memory is that there was a proposal to do more of a linear instead of a nodal pattern. And so really, this kind of helps accommodate a little more that would have been picked up in a linear. So having a radius just around the corridor. So this was to accommodate, I think, some of that without completely going away from the nodal, which is what we heard you preferred.
Are you wanting us to vote option A or B as we go through these to get to a total recommended sign code, or are these just options for the governing body themselves?
No, these are for you.
Right.
So the way, where it says recommended in those tables, that's what's in your tab, your sign code tab.
Okay.
If you want to change from that recommended column, then there's an option there for you to consider as well. So if you don't do anything, basically, tonight, you're adopting the recommended column in all of these.
So someone might craft a motion that says, we move to approve except the highway sign exceptions or something.
And we would recommend, if you could, do an amendment specific to that item and then discuss. But we can get, I mean, it's really up to the body. If you want to get through these options, come back, discuss, whatever, it's fine with us.
Would the commission like to discuss these one at a time as they are presented, or do we want to wait until they're all presented and then discuss? Any thoughts?
I think we should just go one by one as we go, so it's fresh in our memories.
Right. Is there any discussion about the highway sign exceptions then, at this point?
I don't have any, problem with the recommended option, the 100-foot increase.
I agree, Madam Chair, I'm good with option B.
Any other thoughts or concerns?
Okay. I'll go on to the next issue, signs for construction projects. So the issue here is that a lot of signs used in relation to the construction projects are temporary in terms of their construction. They're of flimsy material, they're flexible fabric, banners on fences, that type of thing. We do have recommended standards for temporary signs. They're limited to 30 days, they're limited to a time limit. Construction signs don't conform to that time limit. Construction projects typically last, if it's a commercial project, it's going to last more than 6 months, maybe more than a year. And can we address these differently? And we looked at it closely, and we can do it based on use. Legally, we can do it based on use. And so we drafted this. Signs associated with temporary use of a building or site, including buildings or sites undergoing construction during the time of said temporary use. Any questions about that?
So does temporary still mean 30 days except construction, or are we falling back to say, well, the temporary use has to be defined, and then the sign is based on the temporary use?
So, Madam Chairman, what we're recommending is that this text be under the exemptions part of the code.
Okay.
And if I might backpedal just a little bit, if you look at the sign code, it might help to kind of consider how this is constructed. Keep in mind, our emphasis or our goal with this meeting is to try to get all the content in here and not necessarily have it formatted in what it's going to look like in its final form. So it's, in some ways, it looks a little messy, but if you look at the applicability section, within the applicability section, which is 1810.020, there is a section on exemptions. So it's actually drafted in there right now, page 2. Signs associated with temporary use of a building or site, including buildings or sites undergoing construction during the time of said temporary use. Okay?
Is there a need to define construction? I mean, you have a pile of dirt in the yard during a period of, I might be in the weeds, but since we have a building permit out.
Yeah, I think we can, and when I say we, I look at Mary and say we probably can.
It could be like during, until you have a couple minutes like that.
Right, a permit would be a logical, yes.
Someone may be using it.
I was going to suggest Merriam-Webster, but anyway.
Good point.
But yeah. If there aren't any questions, I'll move on to the next one. So, non-conforming signs, just so to kind of recap what we discussed in the past, non-conforming signs, there are kind of different ways to approach non-conforming signs. Anytime you make a substantial change to a sign code, you're going to have non-conforming signs. And there are aggressive ways to address that, to get compliance, and less aggressive ways to get compliance. An aggressive way to gain compliance would be to say that within a certain amount of time, if you have a sign that's non-conforming, you have to remove the sign and replace it with a non-conforming sign, or don't have a sign at all. That's sometimes referred to as amortization. There's a question specifically about that. Certainly, if you can implement that, and if your goal is to really get rid of non-conforming signs, that's the way to do it. There are legal limitations. Those are noted on page 3 of this. And cities that have been successful with an amortization program, the reason why it's called amortization is you look at the sign and a return on investment for that sign. You have let's say you have a sign that's 20 years old and it has $10,000 or $20,000 in value. I'm just pulling that out of the air. I don't know what it would be, but you can try to determine what the return on investment, how long do you have to have the sign to get a return on your investment. And so you set that timetable, and it might be 10 years, might be 5 years. The difficulty of that is you have to go out and enforce it. And the other difficulty of it is it might be seen as a little heavy-handed, and we're not recommending that. The typical way to deal with it is if someone makes an alteration to a non-conforming sign, and this is probably most common with sign codes, then they have to bring that sign to conformance. And that's typically what you'll see in a sign code. One of the concerns that came up with our sign code committee was that you're going to have this huge disparity between what the people that already have signs are allowed to continue and what new signs or what new applicants are limited to. And you will also get this real resistance of a property owner or an owner of a sign to ever change their sign because they know they'll have to conform. So we came up with this idea, and it's something that we've actually tried to do in the past with, in other contexts of allowing changes, and not full compliance, but partial compliance. And so option A, which is what we're recommending, and I hate to read it word for word, but I think that's really the only way I can really cover all the detail. All non-conforming signs that were lawful prior to adoption of the new code and not defined as abandoned may legally continue without being brought into conformance with the new code if no changes are proposed to the sign or property as outlined below. Any alteration or dimensional change of 50% or more to existing sign area, cabinet size, height, or support structure shall achieve full compliance. Any alteration or dimensional change less than 50% of existing sign area, cabinet size, height, or support structure shall at a minimum achieve partial compliance by reducing its corresponding sign area or height by at least 34%. And that 34%, that's a third rounded up. And that's also based on if you have a really tall sign, the tallest you can have, after you make alterations, minor alterations to it twice, it'll be in conformance. So that's what that's based on for the most part. In addition, any reface, change of copy of a sign shall at a minimum achieve partial compliance by reducing its corresponding sign area or height by at least 34% if the change accompanies one of the following events after adoption of the new code. Rezoning of the property. That's rezoning by the owner. But, upon application by the owner, I should say. 50% or more of the primary structure is damaged or rendered not usable. Any major building addition expansion that requires site plan approval. Any major facade renovation that requires approval of building renovation design. Any property that applies or is approved for City of Topeka economic incentives such as the NRP, Neighborhood Revitalization Program, tax increment financing, community improvement districts, etc. Any sign height reduced 35 feet or less in height must conform to monument sign requirements. So what that means is once the sign gets to a height of 35 feet or less, then it needs to become a monument sign. I think that's what was intended. Is that right? So some of the options, you could, option B, require triggering events, the triggering events plus a change of use. So let's say there's not a substantial redevelopment of a property, but you change the use of a building, you change the occupancy per the building code, say from office to assembly or something like that, that would trigger it. We're not recommending that. That's option B. Option C is option A or B, except full compliance with any triggering event, plus a 10-year amortization period from date of ordinance adoption when non-conforming freestanding signs must be removed, altered, or replaced in a manner that conforms entirely to the sign regulations. So that's the amortization option.
Mr. Hall, I'm trying to do some math here in my head. Is looking at the third paragraph where it says any alteration or dimensional change less than 50% of existing sign area, cabinet size, height, support structure shall at a minimum achieve partial compliance by reducing its corresponding sign area or height by at least 34%. Is there a situation where someone might want to reduce the sign area by 25%, but then they would be required to reduce it by 34%? Is that what that's saying?
You want to answer that? Yes. Or I can answer that.
Sure, that's easy. That's an easy one.
Okay. I'm not sure I answered the question very
It
well.
involves math, so I don't know if that's.
If the sign area was changed less than 50%, then it's partial compliance. So the partial compliance in this case would be 34%, at a minimum.
So you have to be
34%.
at least 34%, but if
Yes.
you're gonna do. Okay.
Yeah, so if they wanted to, so just to go to the extreme, you said 25%. They wanted to, not, I don't see, if you want to change it, 1%, then technically, yes, you have to change
At
it
least
34%.
34%. Okay.
So, yeah.
Okay. Just making sure I understand.
So a 60-foot tall sign would become a 40-foot tall sign.
Yeah, and as Mike said, 55-foot height, there's the graphic up there kind of shows you to get to 34%, it's still slightly above 35 feet, so 36 inches, a few inches. So you wouldn't have to convert the monument above 35 feet. So this is pretty unique, and you can speak to this, Mike. This is pretty unique. We've really struggled with trying to work on what we do with non-conforming signs, and we looked at other cities and came to the conclusion that we're a little different than most places, and for good reasons. But we're an older city. We have a lot of our development that is out there right now, has been put out there with a very outdated sign code. We didn't, for whatever reason, did not have these more up-to-date standards in place sooner. So we think there's just a lot of, there could be a lot of ramifications in a place like Topeka that is not a new community. So.
One more question to clarify. That same paragraph or maybe somewhere else here, it says reduce the corresponding sign area or height by at least 34%. So it's an or situation. You can do height or sign area?
Yeah, so if you were just changing the height, for instance, actually that's probably less of a realistic example, but more folks would change the size. Then you would affect the sign area itself.
But you could keep the height
So
if
you
that
keep
wasn't.
the height. That is how it's written. Whether or not that's what everybody thinks it should be written that way is for discussion.
I have a question. So if there's, say that, because there was a discussion, if there's multiple occurrences, the idea is with having the partial compliance, after 2 times, they would be in compliance.
Right.
But, so this says at least 34%. So if with the second one, it takes them below the maximum allowable, can they do a lesser than 34? Are they required to go down 34% even if that takes them below the maximum.
They just have to conform.
Yeah.
At that point.
It's 34% or conforming.
Yeah.
And
Okay, I'm not sure it reads that way.
Fair point. Yep.
That's what my question, I guess, was leading towards too, because at some point you start reducing and then it gets you under 35 feet and then you have to go down to a monument sign.
And
The way it's written in the draft, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. The way it's written in the draft, your first option is to conform.
Right.
As an alternative to conformance, then you have this. So the way it's written, it's more clearly written in the draft, I think, than it is in this table.
yes,
I gotcha.
true.
I guess so, if they reduce the size of the sign to keep the height, and then they go down another round, they can reduce the size of the sign and still keep, so you have a really tall sign with itty bitty.
You could, and I think, yeah,
But that would
Yeah.
still, to go off his question, that would still make it a non-conforming sign for the height, right? So they could potentially go into like a round 3, if they were crazy enough.
right, the two,
I guess that, yeah, they could have forever keep the sign 100 feet tall, but
we,
a bit odd, but.
I see what you're saying. Yeah, again, the way it's written, I think that's how it's written. And the height wouldn't go past 2 rounds, I can tell you. That I know.
Yeah.
But you're right.
I think that's something to consider, is whether it should be or and. If you just change that to and, it has a much different meaning.
Do you have I'm looking at the draft. Is that where I should be looking under non-conforming signs?
Yeah.
On page 10, and I'm not seeing language that says or. Maybe I'm missing it.
Okay, so
So at 18.10.100 on page 10.
you're about to really embarrass me if I'm wrong with what I just said.
I'm not trying to do that, I just want to make sure.
Just to
I
be clear.
Okay, let me see.
think your chart actually covers the language pretty clearly.
The chart is a little more specific, so, well,
Yeah, the language on page 10 seems to say and.
It says at least.
oh,
Yep,
yep,
it
it
does.
does, so there's a discrepancy.
Yep.
What's in the option was what was intended.
Interior or height.
So, it's not to confuse everybody, but if you want to work off of what's in the table, the option A, and we'll amend that, at least in what you want to see. We'll make sure that it reads such on page 10.
Okay, I was talking about the 34% or coming into conforming. I don't see that there's an option. My question was raised. I don't see where it says at least 34% or to conforming.
There, it isn't as clear. It says here you need to conform. Alternatively, you can do this 34% thing. So we could make that clear if that's your intent.
Yeah. The second bullet,
Oh, I
that's
got
what's
you,
intended.
okay. Alternatively. Thank you.
So do you have any kind of timeline of when these would start conforming? Are we talking like potentially 50 years down the line, or 100 years, or 10 years? Do you have like any idea ballpark?
I think people that are more involved with the sign industry, like Virginia and Cindy. Virginia has a lot of experience over time dealing with those types of issues, and she probably can answer that question a lot better than I could.
But is your question, when will this go into effect?
No, I'm just
Okay.
curious by like if we pick option A, when would we start seeing change in our city? Like,
Whenever somebody changed their
Makes a
sign,
change.
and that we don't.
So I mean, they could
No.
just keep it looking nice and not do any major repairs
That is true.
for a long.
That is true.
One thing that would trigger a considerable change would be, let's say you have someone that has a Dairy Queen at a location, and they sell, and Hardee's comes in. Well, that's an entirely different sign cabinet. That's going to require an alteration. It's not going to just be a reface.
Okay.
I do like that fourth paragraph. I mean, we have 2 CIDs before the governing body now on Wanamaker, and as those get adopted, I mean, those automatically then would require compliance in signing for those. So I think we would see some progressive updating and change as a part of that paragraph for sure.
On that note, do you think option B is a consideration, or does that take it too far?
I can kind of, so from going from like a business to a assembly use, inside a business itself, they might have a room that becomes an assembly use. So I wonder how you would define that. You might have a business one day, but you have another business that moves in, and they have a room large enough that it's, if it's big enough, it becomes an assembly, possibly an assembly use. So would that trigger it? That kind of gets, it could be the same business, and they might make a room larger, and then it becomes an assembly.
Oh, I see what you're saying. If it was going from, again, a good example might be the Walgreens on 29th and Gage went from a Walgreens to Plasma Center. In our building code, that would be considered a change of use, I would think. That would trigger, under option B, that would trigger sign conformance. And, but if Walgreens put in a, I don't know, another space within their footprint or addition, that's not what option B is intended for, but.
Madam Chair? Going back to option A, third paragraph again, the picture on the screen though, that's an and case, not an or case. That has been reduced by 34% in both size and height.
Yeah, it's an and, you said and, yes. Yeah, correct. So,
I mean, I'm more comfortable with and than or.
right,
If we're gonna require them to redo the sign, we might as well get both directions towards where we wanna be, but.
I agree.
On the fourth paragraph, in addition to any reface, change of copy, does that mean a different business? Or if, let's say, McDonald's changed the way their sign looks, but it's the same cabinet, is that considered a reface?
Yes.
So it would require them to change more than just the panel they're putting on the cabinet?
if these triggering events are occurring, yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yep.
Any other discussion?
I think part of what, I don't have a complete answer on what Ms. Messina brought up, and maybe we need our sign experts to answer the question, but in terms of how often do most signs simply require one of these triggering events to happen? If a business doesn't change, move, there's no sale, how often are they having to redo signs? If it's every 25 years, and
We'll have Virginia Baumgartner help us.
Hi, I'm Virginia Baumgartner with
Virginia,
Luminous
can you-
Neon. Just
Virginia,
Whoop,
speak
up here.
over, yeah.
I'm Virginia Baumgartner with Luminous Neon. Honestly, there are some things like the pad that may not do anything for, when I was elsewhere, it was there almost 20 years and then they redid their sign as far as the face is required, but it's still a pad restaurant. As far as branding goes, most national restaurant chains require somewhere between 5 and 10 years. You'll get a new look, like we've been doing with Wendy's around town. As far as things like I'm working with 2 or 3 people on Wanamaker right now that are part of the same things that you're talking about, say at 17th and Wanamaker, that's already been approved, where the old Kmart was, where there are other things. I'm not working with their master planner, but I'm talking to other people who are in there, and I'm also looking at other properties, trying to get them to understand they're going to need to comply as soon as this code goes into effect. When things change, they can either reface as it is. So if it's a rectangle like these illustrations, and it's still the rectangle here, but you change your logo, that won't make any difference. If you're Wendy's and now you're the Wendy's girl, which looks better than the old one with the freckles, you know, that can all fit in this same rectangle. That won't trigger this event. But if you were to take this square and then, again, I'm using Wendy's and put the hump thing in this case, then I've got to move it down and I've got to shrink it. It's taken years and years to get to this point. I wouldn't be surprised if you don't see, probably within 15 years, a lot of different things because of there are fewer mom and pops than there used to be. A lot of things come in that are franchise operations, owned locally, but franchise operations. So if they go into a building a little bit like Mike was saying with a Dairy Queen and is now a Hardee's, then you're going to comply with the brand new code. So I would think, you know, within 15 to 20 years, it would look substantially different than it does now. Does that help?
Thank you.
Any other discussion on the non-conforming signs right now?
Madam Chair, I do have one more question. So going back to the or statement, so they could potentially keep the size of that, but shorten it, so it becomes a really big sign shorter if we keep it at or.
Correct, that's it.
Okay. That makes me more in favor of and.
Yeah, I agree. What's the end?
Yeah.
Madam Chair, with regard to option C, the 10 years, that's actually harsher than I was considering in terms of an absolute sunset. I like the idea of combining it with 10 year. I understand we've got the language over here on the right. If we said 20, at 20 everything's got to be conforming or have a different exception, the historical, et cetera, that is that. Is there any issue with putting it at 20? I mean, I'm already hearing that we're probably going to have most of them changed in 10 to 15 years anyway.
I'll respond to that. I think that if you're trying to arrive at a time, unless you want to go way out there and be really risk averse, that's going to require a little more analysis. I don't think we'd want to, I would think, unless, maybe 20 is pretty safe, maybe you don't have to do the analysis. But if you're trying to,
I think 20 is pretty generous.
Yeah. I think
it's pretty
So I'm not
yeah.
really concerned legally.
Yeah,
Okay.
the only reason I was putting it out there is I thought there was pushback on that short of a time period.
That's kind of what I was thinking, which was 20 years, because it's a long time in the future, but at least there's a time in the future when
There will be a deadline.
there'll be a deadline, yeah.
do you want me to make another comment? I have another thought.
And there's not, so
Okay.
it could be amended in the next 20 years to follow it.
Any other thoughts on that sunset period, the amortization?
I thought 10 seemed kind of short myself.
And we'll go there. Okay.
All right, sorry, we're back. All right, so we have to, you want to make a motion with those amendments? And here's what do you want me to repeat back what we heard?
That's probably a good idea, yeah.
Okay. The motion would be to adopt option A, changing, I'll just say the or to and. I have in paragraph 3 and 4. And then also include option C. Actually, I guess you would have, or you could just adopt option C and change the 10 to 20 year. But that combination would be what is, I've heard.
Madam Chair, if I may. Mr. Kennard brought up a good point on the historical. We talked about at the last meeting of potentially having, is that in here still?
It's to
Later?
come. Yeah, we're going to get to it, and
Okay.
we've
But it is
accepted,
in here?
we've accepted those out, and we can go over that sooner rather than later if you want.
Okay.
But we are going to get to that.
I just want to make sure that they're protected if we go with A. Okay.
Yes.
Or others.
There is language in the actual draft
Okay.
code.
Okay.
Just to be clear, was there a strong feeling about option B, the change of use, including that in the triggering events?
I wouldn't mind having that in there because if you're buying a building and changing the use, you're probably doing some work to it anyway, and you know it going into it. So if you know it going into it, you can assess that if you're going to purchase the building. That could be part of your,
So we're talking about option C with all of the triggering events, including the one under option B, changing or to and in paragraph 3 and 4, and changing option C to 20 years? Is that what everybody was understanding?
Yep. In B and C though, I just see full compliance. Are all the partial compliance paragraphs removed from
Yeah,
B
because
and
it
C?
says,
It's A plus those changes under B and C, so we would
Okay.
assume partial
A,
compliance
X.
is still there. Yeah.
I would, maybe I'd take back on the B portion. I like what you have on A. Generally, those, like those, so.
That covers it?
I think that covers it pretty well. And I like having I like having a date, like 20 years from now. We won't have to, it'll be done, but
Yeah, I personally
I think he's right.
don't really care to add B, but A, with the changes that we've talked about, and adding a sunset, it's fine with me.
So option A with the changes to language, include option C with the change to 20 years. Okay.
Do you want
I think we're set on that.
to, okay.
We may need to
are we
craft that a
voting
little
on
bit.
each of these?
I was just going to,
You want to wait maybe until after
Yeah.
the public hearing to actually take
Yeah.
action?
okay.
But I think that's what we kind of have,
Yeah.
I've taken a note here to kind of, that's what we think we agree on at this point.
Okay.
Madam Chair, I just want to make sure, I'm seeing a lot of head nods on the 20 years. If somebody's got objection to that, I'm
I'm good at 20.
curious to hear.
No.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right,
Okay.
next on the list.
Abandoned signs. So abandoned signs, an abandoned sign is defined as any sign on a property which no longer applies to a use of the property because the use has changed or the property has become vacant. So this can take a number of different forms, which we discussed at the work session. Real common one, there's a hotel down the street, red carpet inn. Still says red carpet inn on the sign. That's not a red carpet inn. It's a vacant hulk of a building. So that's an abandoned sign. There are other examples, some more extreme than others. So this is a particular issue in Topeka. Currently, there's nothing in our code that requires an abandoned sign be removed, only that an abandoned sign be well-maintained. Typically, what you'll see in sign codes is that abandoned sign must be removed essentially after a certain amount of time, a lot of times it's 3 months. Or it'll say, a sign is abandoned when the use that it identifies is no longer there, and it has no longer there been for 3 months, therefore, and an abandoned sign is prohibited, therefore the sign has to be removed. And this is a little bit more, there's a lot more nuance to this and a lot more specificity. So first of all, any abandoned sign in existence for a period of more than 6 consecutive months shall be removed, or the face of the sign shall be covered. It's covered with a panel or the sign removed. Any abandoned sign in existence for a period of more than 24 consecutive months shall be removed. Abandoned signs shall be removed immediately when the primary building on the property is demolished or removed. We've had some recent examples of this. One on 10th with Pepe and Chili's, and I think it's Coyote Canyon out at Huntoon and Wanamaker. When an abandoned sign is removed, all parts of the sign, including structural support, shall be removed. Grace period. Any sign made abandoned by this code must comply within 1 year from the date of adoption of the new code. So that's what's being recommended. As an option, it says, option B says, option A, except any abandoned sign that is non-conforming in existence for a period of more than 24 consecutive months shall be removed. Abandoned signs that are non-conforming shall be removed immediately when the primary building on the property is demolished or removed. Grace period, none, effective immediately.
Go through some examples.
No.
We have some examples here in the handbook that might illustrate this a little bit better. Or not. Let's try it. So the first picture on your left there, we've seen before. Under the current code, there's nothing we can do about that other than probably make them paint. So it's in good repair and not flaking off. Under the proposed code, that could be that would be considered an abandoned sign and could be subject to. It would be not subject to. It would be required to be removed immediately under the proposed code. So there's no building on the site. It's clear. Have a sign that is not signing anything. On the right is you can see there's really 2 signs there. We're focused on the sign that doesn't have a panel on it on the top there. So under the current code, we could ask them to add a blank sign cover because it's not in good condition. So we do have that catch-all, has to be in good repair, and we could ask them to cover up the holes on that sign cabinet. So we have that ability to do that right now. Under the proposed code, it would require them to remove that sign altogether if it was considered abandoned for two or more years. So if there, and I think if I remember that in this case there might have been 2 tenants here. Is that a building with 2 tenants? So if there hasn't been a second tenant there for that second sign in 2 or more years, that would be considered abandoned and could be removed or be required to be removed.
We're going. So the picture on the left, option A, grace period, they'd have a year to remove it. Option B, they would just have to remove it after the governing body passed sign code.
Correct. Yes. Yeah, we're proposing a grace period of a year to give people time to be aware. These are not insignificant costs, but on the other hand, we really tightened up in this recommendation that it doesn't even have to be a non-conforming sign. It just has to be abandoned, whether it's conforming or non-conforming. So that's the first thought. A couple other examples may flush some of this out as well. the picture on the left, again, sign doesn't have a cover. We can ask them to put a blank sign cover on that. It's kind of same thing as you saw with that last picture. Under the proposed code, we could ask them to remove that sign as well if it has been abandoned for 2 years. Now, I know that is not necessarily, there is no sign there. So whether or not that is considered, that is abandoned would pertain to the use of the property, not the condition it's in. So assuming there's a use on the property, the question would be, would that be something we could ask them to remove or not? These are sort of the nuances that we don't have all the answers, but this is something we really have to consider because there's, when you tie it to the use of the property and there's a use there, then all we can really do is ask them to cover that sign up. Yes?
So looking at the red carpet, so is that considered a conforming or non-conforming?
That would probably be considered non-conforming because it may not be a monument sign, right?
Is it D1?
Yeah.
It's really close to being a monument sign
very
with the
close.
definition,
Yeah.
but I think the zoning, I don't know how tall that sign is. It's probably,
By intersection.
I'm just thinking about option B. So that you could have signs technically if they're conforming,
Right.
then we wouldn't have 2 and 3, we would have those options under
Yeah.
option B. Am I reading that correctly?
Yeah, I think option B in the red carpet sign case would be very close. Because as Mike said, it's very close to being a monument sign. I think the way we have it written, it might be,
8%.
yeah, it might be. So we wouldn't do anything with it under option B. Yeah.
Other than, I'm sorry, but number 1 would still apply. Any abandoned sign in existence for a period of more than 6 consecutive months shall either be removed or the base.
Correct.
Right.
So we could, right, so
could
we
still
could
do
ask
that.
them to remove the panel and put a blank panel on there.
So if, let's say the red carpet inn, that sign was compliant, and the building was for sale as a red carpet inn, under the first recommendation, after a certain amount of time, they'd have to take the sign down regardless, even if it was a conforming sign?
24 months.
Yeah.
So, I mean, if the building is for sale for 24 months, they have to remove the sign regardless if it's conforming or not?
Under
I'm trying
option
to question that.
Under option A.
Option A, yes.
Is that the right thing?
It's an abandoned sign,
Yeah, yes,
bottom line.
that's, yes.
Madam Chair, if I may, I don't know if you know the answer to this, but is it making it more appealing from a real estate perspective to leave a conforming sign if it's well maintained, like if it's not deteriorating?
Yeah, I think from our perspective, if it's a conforming sign, we should welcome that, and as part of our new standards. If the sign face is not up to date, then that was the intent, is to remove that. But to remove the whole structure, if it's conforming, it's a lot to ask, I think. But we made that recommendation knowing that we gave it we added 2 years, and so I think that was kind of where we balanced that out. There's not a lot of, if you're vacant for 2 years or more, then there's more problems there than just your sign. So my guess is it wouldn't be an issue for those, and that's why we put in the 2 years, regardless if you're conforming.
And the cost would be for the current owner?
Yeah, right. And just behind the scenes from an enforcement standpoint, we would have to go out, I think, and if this passed the way it is, then we we really need to identify these and give folks a heads up that the clock is ticking, you have however much time, so,
Do you anticipate them financially being able to take it down if their property's been for sale for 2 years and
if, my bet is, again, if it's a blighted property, it's been abandoned for 2 years or more, yeah, we'll be just as good. This won't do a whole lot of difference unless we go in there and do it ourselves, which I haven't even got to.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
I have one other question. We talk about covering the sign, and then we all seem to presume we're going to put in a blank panel or turn the panel inside out. Can that be interpreted as covering it in some other way that may not be as acceptable if we don't, I don't know if there's like an industry standard of when you use the term cover, that's what it means. I don't want someone going up there and deciding it's easier just to wrap a sheet around it.
Right, no,
Because it's covered.
Right.
Yeah. There are socks.
Bag.
Aren't there sign socks? Come on up, Virginia.
Yes. I already questioned this myself. When he says cover, we'd say reface. So if it was a plastic thing like this one before that had the double stacked, we'd
Yes.
put in a new face. If it were this version of the slide here, we would probably paint the whole thing out black. That happens to be a flex face. It's pretty large. So something that would block out this stuff on it. He's right, there is something you could actually do a banner or sleeve right over the top of the whole thing. It may or may not last 2 years, but you would have seen stuff like this happen when banks changed names, and they all at one point had to change on the same day. So they had to cover up all the new signs, and then on the magic day, they took them off. So yes, you can sleeve essentially a giant fitted banner. So my question was how? So if they wanted to find the options of covering them, how? Either refacing.
Thank you.
I would like to see that as well.
That's a good point. With the recommendation to kind of define that a little bit more clearly, is there any other strong feelings on option A versus option B?
I am personally okay with both. I think if we go with option B, I'd like to see that it like states that it's like well kept during that time, the conforming sign. If it's a sign that was made in the 70s that's technically conforming and it's kind of falling apart, I mean, I feel like that should qualify for being taken down.
Is maintenance addressed in another part of the code? Is that taken care of elsewhere?
It's addressed in the sign code, so, which is, it is on.
Same page as abandoned signs.
Page 9.
Well, I was gonna, yeah, in your handbook, the word, well, yeah, it's on page 9. Thank you.
If you go to page 9 in the draft sign code, under maintenance.
So if it's not maintained pursuant to the statement of maintenance, then it becomes non-conforming.
Yeah, so we could look at tightening the maintenance part of it, but it's, I would defer to legal somewhat on the wording. It's been fairly, I don't know if it's been, I don't think we've had necessarily a challenge on that yet, but it's been able to, like Gage Center, shopping center sign, that was under that text, right there, we were able to enforce that so it could get painted. So, and the way it looks now.
I tend to like option B as well, except for the grace period part, I guess. I like the idea of a grace period. I'm a little confused about, there's a grace period of 1 year, but then there's also 24 months. So I think there's probably some that could fall somewhere in the middle, maybe?
So, Yeah, so if you think about it, if it became effective immediately under option B, then, and we have documentation that has, and we have evidence to say that sign, the day after this takes effect, has been abandoned for 2+ years, we could go out there and enforce that right away if we had that evidence. I'm not saying we do, but that's what it could happen.
Any
Yeah.
thoughts on that?
The year basically says we're gonna hold off a year, is what that says, yeah.
Madam Chair, I would agree with, I think I agree with you, the 2 and 3 on option B, I'm good with that. And I'm fine with not doing option 5 on option B.
Okay. Any other thoughts on that?
I could get behind that motion.
Are we leaving covered?
And we'll
Facing or painting?
yeah, we would we would have a little more robust definition of what cover means, or replace it with sign face or something to that effect.
Any other comments, questions on that part?
Okay. For the record, what did we, I heard 2 and 3 under option B, kind of this,
Yeah.
Yes.
and 5 under option A?
The
Or
5
did
under
I hear
option
that?
A.
Okay,
Correct.
okay.
Want to go on to the next one?
Yes, please.
Okay, so the next one, at the last meeting, we presented you our recommendation on portable message centers. And our recommendation was that they be prohibited in all zoning districts. And that there be a grace period. Owners and users of portable message center signs would have 12 months from the date of ordinance publication, which is the effective date of the ordinance, to discontinue use of these signs. So, in looking at options, option B would be to allow these as temporary signs in a limited number of districts, C2, C3, C4, I1, and I2 districts. Those are the predominant commercial and industrial districts in the city. Keep in mind there are X districts that are a mix of uses and commercial uses in North Topeka primarily, that they require a permit. That use is restricted to 2 events per year, 30 days per event maximum, 30 days between events, maximum 60 days total per year. Standards that would apply, maximum 32 square feet per side of sign. Any part of the sign containing copying or illumination is restricted to 32 square feet. Keep in mind the current signs are, I believe they're just under 32 square feet, just pretty close to 32 square feet. And that doesn't include the arrow, the flashing arrow on top. Maximum of 6 feet high, flashing lights would be prohibited. Sign must be set back a minimum of 5 feet from any property line. Keep in mind, flashing lights, the way we interpret our code today, they're not permitted, especially these signs, because they look like a traffic device. They look like an emergency sign. So with this, there'd be a setback of 5 feet from any property line. Option C would be the same as option B, but would also allow for non-residential uses in residential districts. So that would allow, say, churches and schools to use them as a temporary sign, again, requiring them to have permits. One thing that occurred since we met last time, these in our current code currently do require permits, and we hadn't had any permit applications since probably 2007, 2008. Again, there are approximately 90 of these, 95 of these in use throughout the city. Most of these are owned by one individual, Rent-A-Sign, and the owner is here tonight. So since that time, the owner has applied for sign permits, I believe for about 57 permits. We're still reviewing those. We've reviewed about half of them. As we've reviewed these sign permits, we started looking at them, and the signs do not comply with the current National Electrical Code because of the the cord. They're not, the cord, the way these signs are constructed, they have an outlet on them, or they have a cord that connects to an extension cord. What's required by the National Electrical Code, and I have not shared this with the owner yet, but what the code requires is that the cord be hardwired to the sign, and that the cord have a GFI protector on it. So the current signs that are in use don't comply with the electrical code. So that's kind of an issue that makes the use of these signs difficult, at least, especially if they're illuminated. And then I already mentioned also that the flashing lights are a problem because they, in the dark, they look like a traffic control device. And there are a lot of problems with that, a lot of safety issues with that.
Any thoughts on this table?
Yes.
Commissioner Messina?
You bring up a really good point. I mean, they have to be safe. Can't have them starting fires, burning a house down and calling me out at 2 a.m. So I do definitely agree with like the flashing lights prohibited. I actually really like option B, minus the restriction on how often they can use them a year. Like I say every time, I really think it's just a little bit of Topeka culture that we have 95 of them in our town. And then other areas have abandoned them, and I think or not abandoned them, but have removed them from their area, and I think that's a loss on their end. Me being 28 years old and being a transplant and from out of Topeka, with a master's degree and a husband, and we came in as dual income, no kids, we were so fascinated by these signs. So I just want to put a plug out there. I still really like them. I still smile every time I see one. I do think they need to be in good repair, and I don't think, the cords and stuff, I think that's an issue. But I will still say, and I'll say every time I get the chance, I don't think they should be prohibited in the city.
It's not in here, but remind me again, what were the survey results?
Oh, there they are. We had, a total of 96% unappealing or somewhat, very unappealing or somewhat unappealing. That's exactly why we made the recommendation we did. There was nothing quite like that received that. And again, it gets back to the intent of what we're here to do is to make our city look better than it was yesterday. So the visual appeal and the pride that goes along with that was and the economic issues that people spending less with lower pride here. It was borne out in that Momentum 2022 report, kind of led us, and the public survey led us to that recommendation. The code issue that Mr. Hall brought up, that's something that's going to have to be addressed. So I don't know how it affects these going forward either way. You mentioned the time period. Did you have a substitute? Just
year round. I think that'd be great. But I'd be willing to negotiate. I know it would take more time and energy to do permits and to allow these. I just think we should do it. No other city wants to do it, but let's do it. I think it'd be great.
Madam Chair, so I actually don't, when they're in really good condition, they don't offend me very much, but I've lived here for over 40 years in North Topeka, and business is closed now, but one of the businesses I remember, it's kind of almost a negative on North Topeka, free hot dogs, dancers wanted. That sign was there probably at Sasnack. Everyone knows. For as long as I've been alive. And it was on one of those signs, and it kind of became a farce and a negative image on that area, you know, so I think I wouldn't be for I don't think they should be permanent. So I think it ought to be defined as, if you were to keep them, it ought to be narrowed down to being very temporary. Because that was, literally, as long as I can remember it in my life, that sign was there with that. And people don't know that sign because it became so bad in a way, you know. It became a bad spot on that community. So.
Do you think option B meets that temporary requirement that you're looking at?
Yeah.
With the 30 days?
I do.
Yeah, I didn't think there was an option I would even consider less than A, but, I mean, to me, B is, I mean, if you had a real use for it and wanted to go, I mean, to the limits of permitting it and getting it for a 30-day period and it's gone after that, and if you really wanted it that bad, then, you know, I could see, I mean, maybe it was for a use that makes sense.
The key is going to be enforcement
Yes,
because
how are you gonna monitor
that's the
restrictions?
the code now, right?
Right.
Is that there's supposed to be permits and I'm assuming there's standards and regulations on those permits.
Yeah, it's not just this portable sign, but it's all temporary signs. We do have an issue, and so where we're coming from, I guess, is if we're going to enforce a time limitation on any sign, why would we go to the length to enforce something that is ranked so low in our community survey? So that's, but if you do keep that time limit in, then they would get a permit. So that's something we don't require with other temporary signs. So this is a step in the right direction. But yeah, Mike?
I would just like to add something. So with these signs not meeting electrical code, I suppose one thing we could do is come up with some way to, I'm not sure you'd go so far as to say they have to be retrofitted or reconstructed to meet electrical code. I'm not sure that would be worth doing that for the owner. I'm not sure it's practical. I don't know if just saying they would be permitted, but they would not be allowed to be illuminated. Just something to think about in your recommendation.
I still haven't heard you say how you're going to enforce this restriction if it were.
So the only way we can, option B? Option B, it says here require a permit.
No,
Yeah.
But we've required a permit before, right? It was 10 years?
Yeah.
Correct. I mean, right now, a permit's required.
Right, there is a permit required. I mean, it's a paper exercise right now. This would, but however, we did update our electrical code. I don't know what it was before, but in checking if it meets electrical code, they would not, as long as they're illuminated. If they're not, then it could meet it.
But, I mean, 60 days, 90 days down the road, and the permitted sign's still out there.
Right, that's the same, it's the same issue that we have with any temporary sign.
And they just exist? I mean, there's no enforcement action taken to remove them?
Portable signs? Any
Yeah.
temporary sign.
Without a permit?
Well, these in particular?
These in particular.
90 days later, when the same sign's still there,
Right.
I mean, its permit expired 60 days ago, is there any action taken to remove that sign?
There would, so this, in the future, there would be they would contact the property owner to remove the sign. And if we knew it was not, if we knew it was still there, so that's typically a complaint. We have one person enforcing 62 square miles.
It's not gonna happen.
So,
not gonna happen.
Well, and I'm also just thinking about too, I mean, these are the 95 or so that we have today, but the way the code is written, it has to encompass things that that hasn't even been invented yet, or we haven't thought about yet, or the next person that comes along hasn't brought to town yet, because a portable message center, this is what we envision with that, but a portable message center could be something else that's less than 32 square feet, is portable and has movable message on it, right? So,
And meets our electrical code, yeah.
and yeah, let's say somebody brings that to town, next week.
Right.
Is that appropriate for the community?
And I'll just add, Madam Chairman, those are available. I mean, you can go online and see these signs, and there are a few of those in use around town, the ones that aren't illuminated.
Right, and I think there's an example
different.
where there's sort of two, one's not portable, one's stuck in the ground, but it has movable copy, it's not illuminated.
Right.
So that would be more like would that be a temporary sign, or?
I think the way this is defined, it would be a portable message sign.
Okay.
It's just.
Even though it's stuck in the ground?
Because it has changeable copy. It just happens to be stuck in the ground. It's not on a trailer. You can define it differently.
Is there a way in that permitting process that the applicant has to verify that all existing permits are in compliance?
No, I mean, no. No. We don't ask for verification or compliance with things we don't know about, so, I don't know how that could happen.
Could we put some kind of contingency on it, like, they'll be allowed for the next, like the other sign, the abandoned signs, like, option B is allowed for the next 24 months, or an additional amendment to the signage code, to, like, change it. So at least it's like, if we are going to get rid of them, let's phase them out, as opposed to today you can have them, tomorrow you cannot.
Yeah, it's an incremental approach is what you're talking about, and that's actually, yeah, kind of a hybrid.
Option A actually phases them out over a year,
Really.
as written.
So what would that phase
They'll
out
have
look like?
12 months.
Like,
Well, and I think what you're getting at is to have, within that phase-out period, is to at least have a little more restrictions about them. At least that's what option B is saying. Under option A, we just assume whatever goes today goes, so which means there's no zoning district restrictions at all, or time restrictions. So, I forgot the question.
It's just, well, there'll be a date certain, but it's just 12 months from now as opposed to tomorrow.
right, but I'm just thinking of more like a little bit longer term of like, right now, they're not in compliance, they don't have permits, they're not safe. But if we give them an option and give them kind of more constraints and see if there's more of an uprising in the crowd, or if it just, it dwindles naturally because people are suddenly like, well, I don't want to go through this work, you guys keep calling me to take away my sign, I'm just going to get a real one. I don't know, I just feel like it may be a little bit more natural without severing the head.
So just to be clear also, currently, the permit is an annual permit. It's
Okay.
good for a year.
Okay,
So if we issue a permit today, it's going to be good for another year.
Okay.
There's a grace period of 12 months that would go beyond that.
So I think what I'm
Yeah.
hearing, Commissioner Messina, is maybe a proposal to do an option B over and you said 24 months, period. So as a starter, that would eventually then be a, and then after that,
we could look at like
option
an
A.
amendment or
Because we'd have to
not.
have something that.
Right, yeah,
So
so
we
like,
can't- yeah.
we could potentially, because I know what all of you think of this, is that it could potentially be 24 months with it changing to, they all have to be gone after 24 months. And that gives us the time that You know, a year and a half from now, we're like, this is going great, they're doing well, let's put an amendment on the signage to extend it, or let's make it more permanent of an option B. That way it still has a termination date, but it gives a chance for these signs. See how flexible I am?
I'm just,
But people find it very
if I can be honest, I think once they figure, oh, we made it, we got past the 2 years, I think we fall back in the same place we've been the last 10, is my concern. That once the pressure's not on, then we stop seeing the eagerness to comply because there's no risk. And we don't have the ability to enforce the way we really need to enforce. And I appreciate your passion, but that's my concern, even if we do it that way, that, yeah, they'll look good for 18 months. I see that a lot about, you know, person's got a period of time to comply, and they comply, and once that compliance period's over and they pass it, then we go back to the old way again. Not saying everyone would do that, but I've seen that, and we have a situation where these signs have not been in compliance for a long period of time with our permit requirement. So I have a concern or of a confidence that even if it showed well for 12 or 18 months, that it would be that way moving forward beyond that. My opinion.
But if I understand these survey results, 80% is saying, even if they're in compliance, they're very unappealing.
Well,
They're just,
there were like 240 or 140 that, or 190 chose to intentionally bypass that question, even though it wasn't the very last one. So if you're looking at that statistics, it would show that they are neutral and have no opinion because they didn't even care to answer it when they continued the rest of the survey. So I have mixed opinions about this question on the survey.
Is the permit typically by the sign manufacturer owner, or is it by the individual landowner?
So the way,
You said you got 57 all at once.
yeah, Commissioner, so that permit application was by the owner of the sign, not the owner of the business or the owner of the property. And that's probably the easiest way to do it, because they have multiple signs and it's more efficient that way. Plus, we're communicating with one applicant who has multiple signs. So we would accept a permit application in either way, either by the owner, just like we would another type of permit application.
Right, so I guess I'm back to my thought of, if the permit applicant is known to be non-compliant with existing permits, would we continue to give him permits?
I think that, so, yes, we would. I mean, we would not say, we're not going to give you a permit because you haven't gotten permits in the past. They're now choosing to comply. We didn't.
No, not in the past, but
Yeah.
Say we pass this.
Oh, okay.
And of the first 30 permits that we give, 20 of those are still there 6 months later. I mean, would we still issue new permits for that 30-day window?
For different locations.
I see what you're saying. Yeah, if we knew about them, yeah, we would probably not. I mean, I think
But again, you're not
administering the code, there is some lawfulness that you have to, you can't be in violation of something and on something else, and particularly if it's one applicant. But if the owners came in themselves, then
Right.
yeah, that would be a totally different story, but
That gives me a little more confidence that, I mean,
Again, we have to know they were non-compliant. If no one's
Right,
reported
no
it,
one's
how do
monitoring.
we know that they're in non-compliance for those 20 signs, or 10 signs, or 4 signs?
yeah, that's not very good.
Unless every time they come in for a permit, we go and check and see if they've got any other permits outstanding. We run out to every one of those properties to check. And I mean, this becomes part of what they discussed for the limited amount of time that they're gonna be here and what we're talking about. We're talking about putting a lot of extra work on the city that's already hurting to get things done with the budget that they have to work with. Yeah, my statement.
public hearing.
I don't know, I feel like I want to give, you know, some room for, especially for a business owner, to give them a chance to, you know, comply. But there's also just, you know, this, you know, there's this survey, there's just anecdotal.
We still do have a public hearing, correct?
We do.
Yeah, I was going
let's-
to remind everybody, this might be a good point to
Okay.
hear from the public. We have a few, I call mundane stuff to go over, but I don't think it will affect the conversation. And we don't want to lose the public either and make them stay here so long. So we want them, you want to hear from them, I'd do it now.
Okay, so let's continue that discussion afterwards. Any other discussion at this moment? Okay, so for the entire sign code update, anything that the public would like to speak to, I would open the public hearing at this point. Is there anyone who would like to speak to any aspect of the sign code? Please approach the podium.
My name is Pat Barnes. I was here before. I think you'll remember when we were talking about this. I just want to start by making an observation about this. You're all sitting here talking about Mr. Holthouse and his business, but nobody's talking to him about his business. It's back and forth about he did this, he did that, he hasn't done this. And I want to tell you something that you may not know. I've been involved in this for almost 40 years. I started out, one of the first clients I had in my career, I'm a lawyer here in town, one of the first clients I had in my career was Martin Outdoor Advertising. So I'm not new to all of these issues. The Martin Outdoor at one time owned every monopole in this city till they were bought by a bigger company, which then was bought by an even bigger company. But these are not new issues. None of it is. These are the same people that have brought this same thing back to generation after generation of people in your very same shoes. And it's always the same thing. We've had issues here that were put in the Portable Message Center reason for having this. They're laid out right there. Poorly maintained, all right, what, you have to eliminate a business in order to see that it's not poorly maintained. Misuse as permanent signs. Is that really all that hard to put a date in a particular sign location as to when it should be there and not be there? Low ranking on visual appeal surveys. Well, let's talk about that appeal. Nobody asked the 150 customers that Mr. Holthouse's company has. Nobody asked one of them. Nobody asked about the 50 recurring customers that he has. Not one of them. Nobody asked. Nobody asked their families. Nobody asked their friends. You have figures here that as I read what I heard here today and what I see in the material you've been provided, that say basically 676 people didn't reply to this part of the survey as seeing a need. I think you have to ask yourself really about the whole sign code, despite all the work put into it, whether you really need any of these revisions. It seems to me that everything I've heard here today is a tweak, not a revision. I don't think it's accurate to say this is the first major revision in 50 years. I've been through at least 3. I think there was one that I don't recall, so at least 4. The monopole business, about 30 years ago, in the late 80s, early 90s, started a huge round of Topeka sign code revisions. And it ended up in litigation, a lot of it. So when we talk about things that affect so many people, we really have to talk about whether or not you engage in a dialogue with them rather than talking over their heads. There isn't anything in here that you've talked about that couldn't be dealt with in a fashion that's satisfactory for having these kinds of signs. And they're not remarkably different from some of the signs that apparently are A-OK, like the temporary signs. So I could address a lot of the inaccuracies that I felt like I've heard in the discussion about this, but I think the biggest one is that there's only one person in this community that you have proposed be eliminated, and that's Mr. Holthouse's company. Is that really a fair exercise of government power and authority? Is there really something that you should be doing? Apparently, he would be in business and has been in business for some time because there are people that want his business. And it's the same with his predecessors. It's been the same argument every time. And that is that this department doesn't want him. It's really that simple.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Before we proceed, can I ask a question of staff? The survey that was put out, was that not advertised to the public widely?
It was heavily advertised to the public.
Okay.
Yeah, it's the most successful survey we've had in the city.
And weren't there multiple public meetings on?
There was multiple, well, there was 2 public meetings back in February, and Mike helped me out. We did identify all the businesses that have these signs, and sent them a notice for the meeting, and you can tell me if I'm wrong on that.
So just to get into details on that, we identified all the users of these signs on arterials and collectors, so all the major streets. There might be others, but we sent notices to them directly that we were in the process of amending the sign code, and it included some mention of portable signs. We also reached out to other heavy users of these types of signs, schools and churches, and we notified them directly. We've had hearings on this, or not hearings, but we've had work sessions. So we've had many opportunities. We've given people a lot of opportunities to talk about this. Our phone lines are open. If someone wants to talk to us, if the owner wants to talk to us, they're welcome to do that. There has been some communication between me and Mr. Holthouse. So we've provided, in my professional opinion, we've provided an overwhelming opportunity for stakeholder engagement.
Yeah, other questions?
Can I make one more point, please? Just one.
One, please. Go ahead.
I think there's been some confusion about why there hasn't been compliance with the permit process. I think Mr. Holthouse would tell you that, and I think they even said, the staff even said the last time we were here, they didn't think that the ordinance covered the portable signs. When he went in for the 50 permits that you spoke of, Mr. Hall, I think he was originally told, well, we don't think you need them, the code doesn't apply to you. Now we're back that it does apply to them. So put yourself in his position. He doesn't think it applies, but now we're saying it does apply. So we got some confusion that has to be worked out too.
That happens with a lot of permits, so I can understand that. Is there anyone else who would like to speak to any aspect of the sign? Sorry.
How you doing? I'm Randy Wheaton. I have house rental signs, so it's only him, it's me and him. So I have my own, so I have maybe about 4 or 5 signs out right now. So it's just not only just him.
Is there any questions?
Can you just tell us a little bit about?
Well, I just started my business here a couple of months ago, had a sign, so just got a few of them out right now, steady buying more. So I do a lot of stuff in the community, Juneteenth, community Thanksgiving dinners. So I had to do a lot of stuff in the community, so I just started doing this business probably a couple of months ago. So I'll share editorial too, so.
Okay. The signs that you have out, are they generally out for 30 days or less?
I just got my first one out here about a month and a half ago.
Okay.
So.
Okay.
I'm on the board of Juneteenth, so I bought my first sign for down there. It's over at Hillcrest Community Center right now.
So that's for a specific event, so when that event happens, it should come back to you, right? It should be done.
Right.
Okay.
But I probably don't have a bunch of them out there pretty quick.
Okay.
Probably 50 or 60 of them.
Do you in your business, do you do any other signage?
Nope. my main business is janitorial. Something on the side I'm doing now.
Any other questions for this speaker?
Okay, thank
Do you
you.
want to, sorry, do you want to share any of your opinions about?
No, I mean, I think the signs is pretty good in Topeka. I mean, it's good for like the small businesses, you know. Can't afford the big signs at $20,000, $30,000. You know, that's something good for the small businesses. So that's my main, that's why I'm getting into it in the churches. Because churches can't afford the big signs, $20,000, $30,000. So I'm about to help the churches out.
But they're not using these signs temporarily, are they?
Right, they only use them temporary. They are using this temporary, not all of the time. So.
Okay. I appreciate it.
All right,
Thank
thanks.
you. Is there anyone else who would like to speak?
Please excuse my appearance. I just came here on the run. I'm Dr. Chris Dyster. I'm a retired dentist who practiced dentistry here from 79 to 97. Followed my sons to college, practiced in Ohio for 20 years, and now I'm back without having retired. Now having retired, and what I'm here for and want to dedicate time to, my time and talents, is through the Momentum 2022 efforts at elevating the city of Topeka that I love. I'm back as of July 1st of last year to Topeka from Ohio. And so also a few of my sons have seen fit to return to the city that they were raised in. I helped found Care Paravel School. I was one of the founders of that back in '79. Started in the attic of my friend's house. So I'm a business owner and have owned a business at 10th and Fairlawn Dental Wise for years in the Brochus and Slattery Real Estate Building, as it was called back then. Probably used all my time, but I just want to say that in general, as I come back and see the city I love in its position, what we all tend to want is the elevation of all aspects of our city. Namely, one, I've been in cosmetic dentistry all my life. That's been my skill. Inside of dentistry is my specialty. And we want our city to be attractive to people that come in, the people that are here be satisfying. And what I look forward to Topeka being is the gem city of Kansas. It certainly ought to be. And so I tend to relate to what Mr. Fried, is that correct? Fried has said, and believe that the city is doing a service to the business owner, and the business owner is doing a service to the city. I've been one myself for 40 years. And so I feel like that temporary signs wouldn't be a problem if they were nice looking, made well, you know, but for a temporary sign, for a temporary.
Yeah.
And there's no excuse, none, for letting signs go by the limit, to pass up the limit and still be there in any way, shape, or form. It's very simple. These things, we want to give this person, you know, a chance to this. There's all types of things we want, depending on what we do. You know, I'd like to be paid by my patients. Well, it didn't always happen. But I didn't allow that to happen. And by the same token, because I'm a taxpayer here, if we have a limit on temporary signs, then we need to be obligated to, and Mr. Fiander has one person for all these miles to enforce. What kind of position are we putting our city planning director in? You know, by sitting around making up, I shouldn't say that because I respect every minute of your time. Thank you for taking this thankless job. But the thing is, we need to be people that then support him in what he represents Topeka wanting and saying, okay, if there's a limit, there's a limit. There's no, it's just like any other law that we have in the United States on a national level. If the law's there, let's do it, or not waste time making things. Can I have 2 more minutes? Just 2 more minutes.
Commissioners, do you have
There's not that
anything?
many people here. I do have something definite that I
Okay,
want to say
2
besides
minutes.
the jaw. And that is, I'm for law enforcement. And it's very nice. I think we ought to be able to go out and simply remove the sign. And I think he should be supported for that instead of criticized in any way for whatever. I want to mention something that's totally foreign to our ears. And just as phone booth manufacturers are kind of out of business now because the digital world has kind of caught up with phones and we all have a phone. We're being forced by cultural change to recognize that some companies are just going to not be needed anymore. They're on, and it's painful. And we'd like to keep things going. And I feel sorry for the phone booth manufacturers who have to think about a different job. And eventually, the energy producers are going to have to go another way. But you know, the GPS system has totally rendered the signage unnecessary. That's something to think about for the future. So what we decide now is going to need to be changed sooner than we all think. My sons kind of laughed at me for being reticent about having a cell phone. But I was an old fogey. I am. I'm an older man now. And it's not comfortable for me to get used to cell phones and what I can do with them. But we're going to have to understand that I don't need a sign in any way, shape, or form, even in an emergency anymore, because I have a cell phone and I have GPS. And so if it's for advertising purposes and we don't want things in the air, then we need to say, no more signage, get them out of the air. I'm for getting everything out of the air we can.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Is there anyone else who'd like to speak? Yeah.
Again, I'm Virginia Baumgartner. A possible compromise, you may be 18 months, that the permit application must have a start and end date. I've seen that at other cities. So if it's going to start on June 30th and end on July 30th, then they can say, is it there on July 31st, which is still a pain in the rear for Becky to have to cruise around town on, but at least it's, here are the dates that we're here are the dates it goes away. It meets our 30-day minimum criteria. It's so many times a year, and that's on paper. That's the only compromise I see for you.
Is there anyone else who'd like to speak to the sign code update? Okay, seeing none, I'm going to close the public hearing portion. I guess I have a question for staff, sort of related to Virginia's comment. What is the permitting process now as far as dates? Do they have to provide a date, an end date and a beginning date, or is it open-ended?
Currently, there isn't, just because, I mean, it's a 12-month permit.
Okay.
That's renewable. I don't think the date in this current code is of any relevance for our permitting. If we were to go with a more restricted time, it would be. We would have to just ask that question.
The permit application would ask, when is it going to be up and when is it going to be taken down?
Right.
And that would be on that application.
Yeah, we can do that.
Is there, to aid in that, would there be a potential of doing like a tag or something on the sign?
Yeah, I mean, I know Yeah, that isn't gonna be in the code, though. I don't want that in the code, how we do the enforcement, but, that's, yeah, you can do, there's ways to be more efficient, if you will. That's one of them, but you don't have to do that to.
There might be some
Yeah.
sort of electronic or some, some sort of database or something would be easier.
You could do an online thing, but somebody still has to go check, yeah.
Mr. Reed?
Are these considered, these are like a subset of temporary signs? They're different?
No, these are a whole separate set.
Okay.
These are not under temporary signs, correct? Correct.
Okay. And what do we allow in the terms of temporary signs now under our ordinance?
Under the proposed or current?
Current.
Current, it's per event. There is no calendar timeframe, or days timeframe. It's just open-ended per event, which is one of the things we're proposing to change, is just to give some start and end days, and not have a nebulous event time, because that's hard. We can't enforce that either. Yeah.
Gotcha.
Yeah, that's even worse. We do have a couple more things, changes that we walked on tonight. I've asked Mr. Hall if you want to go into those so you can have everything. I think there's a couple things that we wanted to bring to your attention, like the historic signs and something else. If that's appropriate now, we can do that, and then we can be done with our stuff.
Yeah, let's do that.
Would you like me to proceed?
Yes,
with that? Okay, so tonight before you, we gave you a memo with all the items that aren't in the current draft or are in the draft that we're proposing revisions to them. And I won't go through every one of them. If you had a chance to look at some of these, some of them are not that substantial. I also want to mention that that Virginia reviewed the draft, every word of it, and I really appreciate that, and I really mean that. And a lot of the changes she recommended are really helpful, but a lot of them really are not really substantive changes, and so we're not presenting those to you. That's something that we will work on between now and the time it goes forward, depending on what action you take tonight. So just want to acknowledge that. So this covers exemptions, sign permits and inspections, particularly who can take out a sign permit. It also addresses a definition for projecting signs. So one of the issues that has come up in the past, which is a pretty important issue, and I think it's particularly relevant to Topeka because we do have older signs, and people do value a lot of those older signs. They're iconic, historic signs. So we had a draft in what we sent out, and we knew that this needed a bit more work. And so we started researching it, and with the help of our chairman, who also is functioning as a sign code committee member and is also an expert in historic preservation, I've got some great advice from her. And so we drafted this language which would allow signs, if they are of a certain character and meet certain criteria, that they could be altered and saved. But it's a very rational approach. So I'll just read it for the language. It's just one paragraph. For the purpose of this chapter, a historic sign is a sign that is listed or determined to be eligible for listing in the National Register of Historic Places, Kansas Register of Historic Places, or as a Topeka landmark, or a sign that contributes to the historic character of a listed property. The alteration or relocation of a historic sign upon approval by the Topeka Landmarks Commission is exempt from the dimensional standards of Section 18. So what that means is, let's say someone has a sign, it's a really old sign, it's kind of neat, I mean, it appears to have some historic value, and they come to us and say, we need to change our sign, but we don't want to reduce it to meet the current standards. It's not a monument sign, or doesn't meet the size standards. And we would say, well, okay, that's fine. Give us information about your sign, and we will have the Landmarks Commission look at it, and if it meets the criteria, then they'll rule on that, and you probably get your sign saved. And some examples are the Chief drive-in sign up at Walmart, Gage Center sign. A lot of this has to do with signs that are related to cultural periods. So drive-in theaters, old drive-ins, like let's say I'm not sure the BOGO sign, drive-in sign would be saved, but that would be an example perhaps. So we think we've come up with a pretty good solution. On the historic preservation ordinance, we'd probably add some criteria to that relate specifically to signs, but that's something we can do over the next 6 months to a year. And in the meantime, this is a good solution. So some of the other issues, we had not addressed signs for residential subdivisions in the draft we sent out, and that was really an inadvertent omission. So we drafted something here, and it's very similar to what's in the current code. I had some concern about it not being content neutral, and did run this by our consultant, and he was okay with it. I won't repeat it, but really what it allows is residential subdivisions of a certain size would be allowed to have signs, even though it's in a residential district, and they might even be able to have a sign in the right-of-way if necessary. It would have to be approved by the city if that was the case. There's a segment in here on off-premise signs, also known as billboards, and we currently have billboard regulations. There's no attempt to make any substantial change to those, but there have been some amendments to our code over the last 10 years where some of the information got lost, didn't really make it into the current draft or current ordinance. And so we went back, we did a lot of research. We met with Lamar Outdoor Advertising, and so that's what that's all about. That does not, I can tell you this is not a substantive change to the way we regulate billboards. It's just a clarification, and it's, I can tell you as someone who's tried to interpret the code, it's very helpful. So that's what that's all about. There were some definitions that we needed to add and revise, and those are also included in this memo. And really that's the gist of it. I'll be happy to answer any questions that you might have. It'd be good if you were able to say that you agree or not agree with these. But that's what that's about.
Is there any discussion about this? Oh, is there more? Okay.
Bill just reminded me, Mr. Feiner just reminded me of something. So we got a little bit of feedback on this section on incidental signs. So we are proposing a revision to this, and a couple significant things about this. So incidental signs were intended to accommodate all these other signs that are out there, but that aren't addressed very well in our other sign regulations. And on this attachment, you can see the photos of the different types of signs. Directional signs, menu boards for fast food restaurants. So we had drafted earlier regulations to accommodate those. The menu boards they were kind of driving some of this. The way the code is drafted, and this is something I haven't had a chance to explain to Luminous Neon yet, but the way this is drafted, a lot of a menu board is not going to be considered a sign, because it's not even, you can't see it from the road. You can see maybe the logo. So if you have a sign that's 60 square feet that's a menu board, you're probably only going to really see as a sign 10% of that, because the rest of it is menu items and prices. It's not graphics that are visible. So we think this covers that pretty well. It also accommodates all the other types of signs. So there's some tweaks to this. The main one being that if someone has a non-illuminated incidental freestanding sign, like a small directional sign that's non-illuminated, there's no reason to get a permit, no electricity going to it, then those would not require a permit. So that was one of the significant things we changed about that. There are a couple other minor things, but that's really what this memo is about.
Any questions or discussion related to the memo? there any further discussion on any of the sign code update, anything that we've talked about up to this point? Do we need to go back and refresh our memory on some of the earlier discussions we had?
Well, I'll just, if I may, Madam Chairman.
Yes, please.
Made a comment, I was hoping that maybe the legal consultant would be here tonight. I did have a concern about frontage restrictions on temporary signs as they relate to political campaigns and whether you can restrict the number. So I don't have that. I don't want to hold up the passage of all of this, but I would just ask that that be looked at and commented on prior to it going to the city.
And actually, I do have an answer.
Oh, okay.
Since we had a talk. State law, the proposed code says that essentially state and federal law trump the ordinance.
Okay.
And there is a state law now that prohibits cities from regulating the number of political signs on private property. So I think, does that answer your question?
That takes care of my
Political signs are essentially exempt.
Thank you very much.
As long as the state law is in effect.
I was gonna say, but so the ordinance or the code would, if the state law went away or if the state law was changed, our ordinance would still accommodate that. It would be a fallback. If that state law went away, then the local code would come into effect.
Yes, it would. But I think at that point, I would certainly want to look at it for possible First Amendment issues.
So
If
potentially
state law goes away.
There's a federal law.
But for now, state law will trump, and you can have an unlimited number of political signs in your yard.
Thank you for looking at it.
And we talked about that at one point. Any other discussion that we need to go back to on the options that were presented earlier and our tentative thoughts on those before the public hearing? Is there anything that we want to change from what we had said earlier? As far as highway sign exceptions, signs for construction projects?
Procedurally, should we vote on each of the options individually to see which ones we're voting on before then we put a vote to the whole code?
Yeah, if I may, I would, if you can certainly vote on the ones you're recommending on changing. I heard, not to try and make this any more efficient, but the first two you just mentioned, it looked like you had nodded on the recommended option. When you got to non-conforming signs, then we started to deviate a little bit, so I would maybe start there and go one at a time, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So let's see if we can formulate a motion on the non-conforming signs. What I think I heard earlier was that we were mostly in favor of option A and option C. But under option A, changing the or in paragraph 3 and in paragraph 4 to and changing the timeline under option C to 20 years instead of 10 years. So combining those, really it's option C, using option A with the verbiage change and changing the time limit to 20 years.
Yeah.
Is that,
Yes.
okay. Somebody want to make a motion to that effect?
Sure, I will make a motion as it relates to non-conforming signs to adopt option C, including option A with the changes in paragraph 3 and 4, changing or to and with the additional revision of changing the 10-year time limit to 20 years.
I'll second it.
There's been a motion and a second. Chris?
Mr. Armstrong.
Aye.
Mr. Freed.
Aye.
Mr. Dean.
Aye.
Ms. Jordan. Aye. Mr. Kennard.
Aye.
Ms. Lawson.
Aye.
Ms. Messina.
Aye.
Ms. Ringler.
Aye.
And Mr. Warner.
Aye.
Motion passes 9-0.
So on the subject of abandoned signs, what I recall was that Option A was recommended, but we did prefer the language under option B for numbers 2 and 3, but leaving number 5 as is with the grace period being the 1 year. And we also recommended some additional clarification on what the term covered meant.
I got that, yep.
Is there anything, any other discussion or any other understanding? Okay. Do you want to make a motion?
I make a motion to approve the abandoned signs, option A as recommended with paragraphs 2 and 3, though, from option B. But we would not recommend paragraph 5 under option B. And further, we would want to see a more robust definition of covered.
Second.
Got a motion and a second. We'll take a vote.
Mr. Warner?
Aye.
Ms. Ringler?
Aye.
Ms. Messina?
Aye.
Ms. Lawson?
Aye.
Mr. Kennard?
Aye.
Ms. Jordan? Aye. Mr. Dean?
Aye.
Mr. Freed?
Aye.
Mr. Armstrong?
Aye.
Motion passes 9-0.
Okay. Next is the portable message centers. And I don't think we came to a full consensus on that. We wanted to hear from the public. Is there anyone who would like to make a motion or further discussion?
I will tell you as I think about this, the only possible compromise I would consider on this is if it were with the option B, would be that it would only be for schools and churches. Because I see the need for in the neighborhoods if people aren't aware of an event nearby and they're driving by and it draws that. But when we get into businesses, we're now talking about a replacement for otherwise what should be under the other business sign. And that concerns me. So I would entertain them only for the purposes of schools and churches, but I would not be in favor of anything else.
Would that be a possibility because of legal reasons?
Yeah.
That's an interesting question. I thought it's not for content or based on a particular religion, it's just for that use. That's the only relevant.
Is there a better way to clarify the use? Because churches and schools can be all different kinds of.
That's more institutional.
Would you be saying option only available for option C? For non-residential uses in residential districts? Wouldn't that would basically limit it to churches and schools, would it not?
There could be potentially other uses, but not very many. Mostly schools and churches.
The concern would be, though, for that is you could have a business somewhere that's still in existence in otherwise a residential area, and they would have the right to use those then.
So that would be a non-conforming use potentially. I think there's a way to maybe exclude them. Conforming non-residential uses in residential districts.
I don't want to create a lot of conversation on this. I just threw that out, but if that's going to be more, and I hadn't thought about that, then I don't want to create more work for everyone to create that exception, but that was my only thought. I could see it as a purpose to gain knowledge in the neighborhood for an event, but I'm not in favor of them as a business sign.
Are all churches and schools typically zoned in a certain zoning category?
Yes, and so most churches and schools are going to be zoned R1, most of them. That doesn't mean all of them are, and that doesn't mean they have to be. I do remember a question I asked our consultant about another city that does something like that, and he thought it was, I wasn't getting a legal opinion, like a written legal opinion or anything, but he thought it was questionable.
I think it is.
Because it yeah, kind of seemed discriminatory or something.
Chair, my thought was if we went with option A or option B, maybe option A, maybe 12 months isn't enough. maybe we give it a little bit more time to find something, other usage for their signs, and option B, that having a phase out, that would be for that also, so. I don't think I'd like to see them long-term, but I like having it somewhat of a phase out, so that just, it's not tomorrow, they won't, it's fine.
I think I came here thinking I'm option A all the way, but I feel much more comfortable with some kind of an option B now.
I'd just like to have it clarified, the safety issues identified are really not impacted by our decision here. I mean, they have to be up to code from a safety standpoint outside of the sign code as we're proposing it now, correct?
Yes. I think the way to resolve that is they would not be able to be illuminated unless their electrical is brought up to code.
Is that something that we need to dictate here, or is it through the permitting process? I think is what you're asking.
Well, you have to answer the question, do you want portable message centers illuminated or not? And then because we can't, someone said it, there's going to be others that come that do meet our electrical code. So it would be better if you give us direction, should they be illuminated or not? And then they all have to meet code. That goes without saying, I guess, in the sign code. They have to meet building code.
I don't know that the illumination bothers me, other than the flashing. Obviously, I can see where that's a problem, but if they're going to be illuminated, they have to meet other codes. Is there any other thoughts as far as what was mentioned, other time frames or on either option A or option B?
I guess a question for staff. If option B, what would be easier to evaluate? A 24-month reevaluation of compliance to date with option B, or terminating option B in a 24-month period? I mean, terminating it, you'd have to have, well, I mean, that just means it goes away. But I mean, if you put a 24-month evaluation date in that triggered a review, is that something we've kind of done on some other things?
I don't know that, and I'm kind of looking at Mary, but I don't know that I would want that. I don't know that we can necessarily have that codified. What we would normally do is just say, okay, here are the standards, and these will expire in 24 months. And then, but the code shouldn't say what comes after that, whether.
That's unmanageable.
Okay.
Is that, Mary?
Yes, do you want a 24-month amortization period? In other words,
Basically, I think that's.
Yeah.
is that what you want? That's what you're talking about?
I think that's what we just talking about.
And also, if there was a community outcry who, after 24 months, that was not long enough, they really want these, that could be brought to representatives in the community, the city, to say, hey, it's been 24 months, but we don't want these to go away, we still want these.
Question, clarification, maybe you haven't got this far. Are we talking about option B with a 24-month period, or option A with a 24-month period?
I'm more in favor of B.
B, we're
Okay.
talking about B.
Yeah, same here.
Guys make my heart warm. Madam Chair, if I may, staff, do you guys have any, like, different opinions or enlightenments from what you put in here from the discussion today?
On this? I mean, I really, you're getting at where we were trying to get at, it's just different time period. It's more, you're making things better. You're moving something forward, and I think it ends up being allowed, just more restrictive, and then ultimately phased out, which I have zero problems with, so.
Chair,
would we also need, in order to address what Ms. Baumgartner brought up on the permitting, does that need to be addressed here if we want it to have a beginning date and an end date on the usage? Or is that simply mechanically happen for you?
I think we would, we need language to say it needs a permit, which this option B does. So as long, and we have the time frames in here, so we will amend our forms to accommodate that.
Madam Chair, if I may also bring up, I know we keep saying option B, but do we also want to include the non-residential uses in residential areas in the verbiage of option B so that schools and churches and stuff are covered in this?
I agree with that. I mean, I like the option that Mr. Freed was talking about earlier. It just didn't seem like it was quite doable to only restrict it to that.
Okay.
So really, yeah, it's option C, but with a time limit of 24 months, it sunsets, it goes away. I think this also addresses a concern that was brought up earlier, that it's very clear that these require a permit.
Yes.
So whether it's the owner of the sign or the business owner, the property owner, there has to be a permit. So that will clarify that concern. Is there any other thoughts or discussion? Someone?
Just to clarify, so it's, we're looking at option C with all of B's components with a 24 or without a 24, or whatever month. Is there an extinction period? Okay.
I think 24 months is a good time period.
Okay. I do as well. If we're gonna put one on there, I'd rather it be 2 years.
Is there any, go ahead. Oh.
Motion away.
Madam Chair, I make a motion that we, under the portable message centers, we go with option B and option C with a phase-out period of 24 months.
Second.
Any other discussion? There's been a motion and a second.
We'll just.
Mr. Armstrong?
Aye.
Mr. Freed?
No.
Did you say no?
No.
Okay. Mr. Dean?
Aye.
Ms. Jordan?
Aye.
Mr. Kennard?
Aye.
Ms. Lawson?
Aye.
Ms. Messina?
Aye.
Ms. Ringler?
Aye.
And Mr. Warner?
Aye.
Motion passes 8-1 with Mr. Freed deciding.
Do we need to make a vote on anything further?
Yes.
A and B, the first two.
You need to just make a motion to approve the amendments as presented by Mr. Hall on the memo dated May 20th.
And then will we actually need to vote on the whole thing?
Right, with all the exceptions.
This would be the last amendment you would vote on before you vote on the whole thing,
Okay.
if that makes sense.
I think the
Okay.
ones as recommended.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So at this point, we're discussing the memo that should be in front of us dated May 20th, 2019 from Mr. Hall. Was there any further discussion or questions related to that? Does anyone want to make a motion about that particular amendment?
Well, I would make the motion that we accept the amendments in the May 20th memo from Mike Hall about the visual code update, 3 sign code update.
Second?
There's been a motion and a second. Any further discussion? Okay, Chris?
Mr. Warner?
Aye.
Ms. Ringler?
Aye.
Ms. Messina?
Aye.
Ms. Lawson?
Aye.
Mr. Kennard?
Aye.
Ms. Jordan?
Aye.
Mr. Dean?
Aye.
Mr. Freed?
Aye.
And Mr. Armstrong?
Aye.
Motion passes 9-0.
All right, so now the entirety of the code with the amendments that we've just made votes on. Is there any discussion overall?
Oh, no.
Okay. You ready?
Yeah.
Sure.
I move we accept the Visual Code Update 3, sign code update, with the already passed changes to the highway sign exceptions, sign for construction projects, non-conforming signs, abandoned signs, portable message centers, and the Mike Hall memo.
Second.
I didn't.
Who second?
There's been a motion and a second to approve the whole thing. Any other discussion? Chris?
Mr. Armstrong?
Aye.
Mr. Freed?
Aye.
Mr. Dean?
Aye.
Ms. Jordan?
Aye.
Mr. Kennard?
Aye.
Ms. Lawson?
Aye.
Ms. Messina?
Aye.
Ms. Ringler?
Aye.
Mr. Warner?
Aye.
Motion passes 9-0.
All right. Lost our agenda. Any communications to the commission?
Well, thank you. Very good discussion tonight and deliberation, so I want to thank you for that. No, the only other thing was if you noticed, your case, you didn't get a remand back to you, so, with the AT&T tower, so that did pass city council in May, in 2 weeks ago, for the one at 6th and Taylor. So they did end up approving it and concurring with your recommendation. So I think, just so you know, if you're not, there was a lot of 18 questions to AT&T to kind of basically prove that this was the only real opportunity they had and the best. And so they provide more information that you didn't see at the time. So that helped get to that point. That's all my communications.
When do you think the sign code will go to city council?
I mean, I think it'll take a little bit to draft the code as I look at Mary. So let's not,
Okay.
yeah, I mean, I think later this summer, mid-late summer should be there. But I don't know when Mary's vacation is, so.
How long will you? I've moved to adjourn?
Second.
Thank you.
Like it says next time, put it in the historical.